Greetings. Welcome to the first episode of my new YouTube channel, Skowinski Strategic. If you enjoy examining and exploring the pressing issues facing today's world from an objective, balanced, and in-depth geopolitical and historical perspective, I invite you to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support will help me to continue providing more content like this, and of course, feel free to share and recommend this channel to your friends. Today's episode will be Understanding Trump 2.0, a geopolitical deep dive. This isn't about praising or condemning Trump, but rather trying to discern and better understand his strategy. To date, his foreign policy has often been dismissed by the media as chaotic, impulsive, or even outright unrealistic. But is there a deeper strategy behind his seemingly erratic moves? In this episode, we'll examine Trump's geopolitical approach to see whether or not it follows a calculated method. And along the way, we'll discover if it is reflective of the playbook of past world leaders and statesmen. The seeming madness. Is there actually some method behind it? Even before he was sworn into his second non-consecutive term as U.S. president, Donald Trump made it clear that his domestic and foreign policies would differ greatly from those of his predecessor, Joseph Biden Jr. The most immediate and high-profile shift centered upon closing the U.S. southern border, not just stopping, but reversing the influx of illegal migrants, which had likely exceeded the number of 10 million by 2025. Trump's other foreign policy priorities included ending the war in Ukraine, restructuring trade relations with major partners, and reevaluating NATO funding. However, he remained relatively ambiguous on how these objectives would be achieved. Then there were the more unexpected and unusual pronouncements, such as the U.S. acquiring Greenland, or reclaiming the Panama Canal, or incorporating Canada as the 51st U.S. state with Justin Trudeau as its first governor. There was even an out-of-the-box idea about requiring and rebuilding the Gaza Strip. These proposals, of course, sparked controversy, ridicule, and uncertainty regarding Trump's seriousness in pursuing them. Without a proper context, these ideas sounded implausible, and their seriousness remains debated. Clearly, being unorthodox, taking novel approaches to geopolitical dilemmas, and playing unexpected wild cards is what we all think of as something Trumpian. But what really guides his decision-making? Is there a deeper strategic purpose to what some are calling seeming madness? Make America great again, and America first. Basically, a return to realpolitik. While many tend to dismiss Donald Trump's policy positions as erratic or impulsive, an impression often amplified thanks to his habit of making all-caps posts on Truth Social or X, they are at their core rooted in a consistent theme across both his presidential terms: putting America first. Unlike the post-1945 framework that shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades, Trump views the world as being in a state of transition. In his eyes, the collapse of the post-Cold War order is now reshaping geopolitical, economic, and military realities, making way for a 21st century landscape that more closely resembles that of the 19th. One that's defined by fluid, transactional alliances, refocused spheres of influence, and pragmatic foreign policy stances where former adversaries can become strategic partners if interests align. British historian David Starkey has observed that this realignment of the new presidential administration's geopolitical policy making, and he's drawn comparisons between Trump 2.0 and Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the third Marquess of Salisbury, commonly referred to as Lord Salisbury. the 19th century British statesman who rejected long-term alliances and who favored engaging in international affairs only when it directly benefited Britain. Salisbury believed firmly that diplomacy and persuasion were more effective than force because he too recognized that Britain's global position was shifting in his lifetime. Similarly, Trump is reassessing America's role upon the world stage today, challenging long-standing commitments and questioning whether traditional alliances still serve U.S. interests. Drawing parallels between Trump and Salisbury highlights a shared list of inclinations and priorities. First, there's a prioritizing of national interests over collective agreements. Lord Salisbury maintained that Britain should involve itself in international affairs only when that served her own national interests, and otherwise it should be avoiding any entangling alliances. Trump has exhibited a similar approach through his America First doctrine, reassessing U.S. participation in multinational agreements and organizations. His administration, for example, withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change and the nuclear deal with Iran, arguing that these agreements disproportionately constrained U.S. sovereignty while offering minimal tangible benefits in return. Similarly, Trump renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, emphasizing more favorable terms for American workers and industries. The second commonality with Salisbury is a skepticism with respect to long-term alliances. Trump has proven cautious about long-term alliances, preferring instead flexible, interest-based engagements. This skepticism is most evident in his approach to NATO. During his first term, Trump consistently criticized NATO allies for failing to meet their agreed-upon defense spending commitments, and arguing that the U.S. had been shouldering an unfair financial burden for years, while simultaneously the European NATO partners were focused more upon their domestic matters, as well as implementing trade policies within the EU that disadvantaged American products and companies. Trump repeatedly asserted that European allies owed the alliance vast sums of money for defense, emphasizing a very transactional view vis-a-vis international commitments. Now, under the Biden administration, NATO funding eventually improved, with 23 of the 32 members more or less meeting the 2% GDP defense spending threshold as of 2024. However, Europe's defense spending had been neglected undeniably since the 1990s, and from the Trump 2.0 perspective, it took an existential threat, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to finally force European nations to take their security seriously. After the recent Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, and subsequently increasing sharp differences over the war in Ukraine, Europe finally appears more committed to building up its own military capabilities. Yet this seemingly positive development also further highlights the divergence between NATO's priorities and America's national interests, because while Europe remains committed to supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia, the U.S. under Trump's leadership is now engaged in pursuing a negotiated settlement to end this conflict. Conditional defense commitments is another point Trump has raised by questioning the automatic expansion of security guarantees to NATO members, suggesting that U.S. support ought to depend on whether or not those same nations had fulfilled their obligations to us. The conditional approach departs from the traditional understanding of NATO's Article 5 collective defense principle. And of course, there are reports circulating now that suggest that Trump has seriously contemplated withdrawing the U.S. from NATO completely, a stance reflecting a fundamental reassessment of the alliance's value to the U.S., its strategic interests, both now and in the future. While President Trump had privately floated this idea of pulling the U.S. from the alliance during his first term, Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, has now publicly backed such efforts in recent weeks, saying it's time to leave the alliance after NATO countries held an emergency meeting with Ukraine and London without the US. Lee said in an X post on Sunday, the March 2nd, 2025, that if NATO is moving on without the US, perhaps the US should move on from NATO. And he also suggested various clever names for that movement on the following day. Allies, of course, counter that Trump's NATO skepticism, both private and public, just weakens the collective security of NATO members, including that of the USA. Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, warned in February 2025 that U.S. wavering vis-a-vis the alliance could actually go on to embolden Russia, arguing instead that a united front, however costly, beats going it alone. The third similarity with Lord Salisbury is an emphasis on diplomatic engagement over military intervention. Beyond military alliances, Trump has reshaped global diplomacy with a preference for direct negotiations over conducting them via conventional diplomatic channels. This was most evident in his historic meetings with Kim Jong-un and in the landmark Abraham Accords. His willingness to engage directly with North Korea, for example, marked a departure from traditional diplomatic protocols. Instead of following the conventional approach of isolation and deterrence, Trump opted to hold historic face-to-face meetings with Kim Jong-un, believing that a personal diplomacy could achieve more than military posturing. While the long-term success of this strategy remains debatable, it reflected a clear preference for negotiation over escalation. Trump's Abraham Accords, formalized in 2020, which led to the normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, are also another example. This initiative marked a significant shift in traditional approaches to Middle East diplomacy, prioritizing dialogue and cooperation over long-standing hostilities. Trump's approach, moreover, reflected a preference for resolving complex international issues through diplomacy rather than military means. Again, consistent with the strategies of leaders like Lord Salisbury, who advocated for strategic restraint and diplomatic solutions. Fourth, the preference for bilateral trade and bilateral trade negotiations. President Trump's preference for bilateral trade agreements over multilateral ones also reflects a foreign policy consistent and reminiscent of Lord Salisbury's, with its emphasis on flexible, interest-based engagements. This strategy focuses on negotiating trade deals directly between two nations, allowing for tailored agreements that prioritize specific national interests without the complexities of broader multilateral commitments. During his first term, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, a multilateral trade agreement, in favor of pursuing individual trade deals with countries like Japan and South Korea. This shift again underscored a preference for a transactional approach to diplomacy, where economic benefits were prioritized and kept in alignment with Lord Salisbury's cautious stance on long-term alliances and a preference for diplomacy over military intervention. Furthermore, President Trump's recent imposition of tariffs on Canada and Mexico as part of a broader strategy to address trade imbalances and other concerns continues to illustrate this continued bilateral focus. Unsurprisingly, these measures have now prompted discussions about the effectiveness and repercussions of such an approach to global trading. As of Tuesday, the 11th of March, 2025, the tit-for-tat tariffs between the U.S. and Canada saw increasingly upped antes. In response to Premier of Ontario Doug Ford's announcement that he would go on to impose a 25% surcharge on electricity coming from Canada's most popular province, a province which supplies 1.5 million U.S. homes with power, Trump simply said that he would double U.S. tariffs on all imported steel and aluminum products from Canada to 50%. Clearly, this was a situation that could not last long because it would place undue costs and burdens on citizens on both sides of the border, and ultimately both countries would endure needless financial pain. And within hours of Trump's threat, Ford blinked. While appearing as a guest on Katz and Cosby, a New York City-based podcast hosted by business magnate and outspoken conservative John Catsimatidis and broadcast veteran Newsmax personality Rita Cosby, Ford not only backed down publicly, he all but groveled, as the New York Post phrased it. He went on to say, quote, "I want to apologize for going back and forth like this to the American people. I spent 20 years of my life in the U.S., in New Jersey, and in Chicago. I love the American people. I absolutely love them," Ford said during the podcast. As Trump moves forward with his solutions to resolve perceived and real unfairnesses in their cross-border relationships and trade, we can expect more of such personal involvement and such public displays of brinkmanship. The world is in transition. Yes, it's a real thing. The similarities between Trump and Salisbury also reflect a broader shift in strategic thinking, one that prioritizes national interest over rigid alliances, and it's one that demands greater burden sharing among allies, one that emphasizes diplomacy over military intervention. While this approach has been met with praise and criticism, it again represents a break from the post-Second World War order of consensus in favor of a more pragmatic world of transactional engagements. Trump's perception of a world in transition isn't just his personal opinion, however. It is a reality recognized by noted historians such as David Starkey, Victor Davis Hanson, as well as serious analysts like political scientists George Friedman, and economist and geopolitical thinker Jeffrey Sachs, who has frequently spoken about the shifting global order, particularly emphasizing the decline of the U.S., unipolar dominance, and the rise of multipolarity with China, Russia, and the global South playing larger roles. Sachs, no Trump supporter himself, has often argued that we are not entering into a new tripolar world dominated by the U.S., China, and Russia, but rather a new reality he calls the New World Century, in which the rapid spread of technology and the sovereignty of nation-states mean that no single country or region will dominate the world. For Sachs, the great future and foreign policy challenge will be to manage cooperation among regions. And in his mind, the idea that one place or one people should have primacy over any other should be as antiquated as slavery or empire. Speaking with Tucker Carlson at the World Government Summit back in February 18, 2025, Sachs said, "Our new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, called a fundamental truth. We are in a multipolar world. First time that sentence is uttered, he told the truth. What does it mean? Well, it means the American mindset for 30 years was we run the show. Marco Rubio said, well, we don't run the show. We live with other powerful countries. A great start." Sachs then went on to voice support for Trump's decision to break with the past and propose a negotiated settlement to an unnecessary war, one that had continued for far too long because the preceding presidential administration and NATO allies remained entrenched in the old ways of thinking that dominated Western geopolitical strategy since the end of the Cold War. Sachs offers a nuanced lens through which we can analyze Donald Trump's geopolitical strategies because his critiques of U.S. foreign policy and economic positioning provide a framework that aligns with several of Trump's stances, albeit from a more academic and systemic perspective. First, Sachs notes the rising multipolarity and the economic shifts in our world. Sachs frequently highlights the decline of U.S. economic hegemony, particularly in global trade and finance. He underscores the rise of multipolarity in our world, where emerging economies like China and India challenge the traditional dominance of Western powers. In 2024, for example, China's exports to the BRICS partners rose 10% to $300 billion per intra-BRICS trade trends, while U.S. exports to NATO and the allies rose by just 4%. And as a result, China had a $1 trillion surplus. Trump's preference for bilateral trade agreements and his skepticism toward multilateral institutions such as the WTO can be interpreted as a pragmatic response to this shifting landscape. Sachs would argue that Trump's approach, raising tariffs to aiming to claw back economic leverage in a fragmenting world, while being controversial moves, reflect an acknowledgement of the diminishing returns of globalist economic policies for the U.S. Second, there's a manifest U.S. foreign policy fatigue. Sachs has been a long-time vocal critic of America's interventionist foreign policy, which he believes has overstretched U.S. resources and, ironically, eroded its global influence. This critique resonates with Trump's reluctance to engage in prolonged overseas conflict and aligns with his emphasis on diplomacy over military intervention. And additionally, Trump's America First doctrine could be seen as a reflection of the broader public fatigue with interventionism, thus tapping into a populist theme advocating for recalibration of U.S. foreign policy priorities. In 2024, for example, 50% of Americans told Pew Research that they're tired of foreign wars, a sentiment that Trump taps with his Ukrainian peace push. And this breaks from Biden's NATO-led escalation. Sachs sees this as a long overdue pivot from an overstretched empire. Third, there's an acknowledgement that challenges of China and the BRICS nations are on the horizon. Sachs recognizes the growing influence of these BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their shaping or reshaping of global power dynamics. Trump's trade war with China and his skepticism vis-a-vis multilateral alliances could be seen through the Sachs lens as a strategic, albeit contentious effort to address the economic and geopolitical challenges posed by these emerging powers. Sachs might argue that such actions, while often criticized as nationalist, are rooted in a legitimate need to adapt to a rapidly evolving global order. For example, post-Kazan 2024, the 16th BRICS Summit, the member states of the group adopted the BRICS new payment system, which aims to ditch the US dollar, with Russia enjoying a 30% local currency trade by 2025. Trump's counter to that? Tariffs and bilateral trade deals like the USMCA to keep the BRICS economic clout in check. There's also another perspective. For example, is Trump following a strategy of offensive realism, and all to perform a political Pacific pivot? Political scientist John Mearsheimer also notes that Trump is set to fundamentally change America's foreign policy, but he doesn't quite see that change as necessarily one of Trump looking at the world through a multipolar glasses. Rather, he sees Trump following his theory of offensive realism. Put simply, this geopolitical philosophy argues that 1. The world is an uncertain and competitive place. Countries exist in an anarchic system. There is no higher authority above them, so they rely on themselves for their security. Point number 2, all countries want to survive. Since no one knows for sure what others might do, every country prioritizes its survival and safety. Point 3, power is key. To feel secure, countries try to become as powerful as possible. The more power they have, the safer they feel. And point 4, conflict is just hard to avoid. Because countries are constantly competing for power, clashes or conflicts are almost inevitable, even if both sides don't want to fight. In essence, Mearsheimer believes that countries act aggressively and seek dominance, not only because they are naturally bad or greedy, but because the structure of the international system forces them to behave this way to protect themselves. This is why it's called offensive realism. It emphasizes the pursuit of power to ensure security. During the so-called unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, until Trump's first inauguration in 2017, many people had argued that Mearsheimer was a geopolitical dinosaur because his realist ideas, it was said at the time, were completely outdated. They might have been relevant in the 18th century or the 19th century, but they no longer applied today. Now, however, Mearsheimer maintains that it is quite clear that realism is alive and well and thriving in the arena of geopolitics. In an interview conducted on the 7th of March with Germany's Der Spiegel International, Mearsheimer said, quote, "When Trump was elected in 2016 and took office in 2017, he had two principal foreign policy goals. One was to abandon engagement and adopt a containment policy towards China. In other words, make a 180-degree turn. The second goal was to fundamentally change relations with Russia, and particularly with President Vladimir Putin. He was successful in changing our policy toward China, but he was unsuccessful regarding our policy toward Russia. He basically continued the policy on Ukraine and Russia that his predecessors had pursued. He's going to do now, in his second term, what he was unable to do in the first." Mearsheimer then went on to state that Trump really has no problem with Russia controlling a large slice of territory in Ukraine. But it's a different story in East Asia. Again, quoting Mearsheimer, "China is a pure competitor that wants to dominate East Asia. We are also in an intense competition with the Chinese in terms of developing artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and quantum microchips. In recent years, the United States hasn't been able to pay much attention to China and East Asia because we were pinned down in Ukraine and the Middle East, supporting Israel in its various wars. If we get out of Europe and the Ukraine conflict is settled, there is reason to believe that the intensity of military competition between China and the United States will increase. Trump wants to pull U.S. military forces out of Europe so he can pivot to Asia, according to Mearsheimer. And he wants the Russians on America's side, not on China's. With NATO's expansion and the resulting war in Ukraine, we have foolishly driven Russia into the arms of the Chinese. Trump is trying to at least get the Russians into a neutral position, or ideally, get Russia lined up with us against China." In geopolitics, change is the constant. Regardless of the philosophical underpinnings motivating Donald J. Trump in his second term of office, it's certain that his geopolitical thinking and policymaking will redirect America's attention and energies beyond the scope and priorities that shape the post-Cold War world order that the Western world has grown accustomed to and has perhaps taken for granted. Everything we have discussed in this examination of the possible motives behind the changes that we have seen, and which have become necessary due to shifting global power dynamics that America must react to and embrace. And as the world moves further into an era of great power competition, the question remains, is Trump's strategy a necessary recalibration of U.S. foreign policy, or does it risk accelerating America's decline? This answer will shape global affairs for years to come.